In this video, I'm going to show you how I replaced the front shocks on my 95 Ranger. I'm also going to show you some challenges you might run into and also offer some advice and tips to make this project go a little bit more smoothly. Now, keep in mind, I'm not a professional. I'm a software engineer. My degree is in computer science. So take whatever I give you in this video with a grain of salt. I don't know what I'm doing. But I've installed shocks and coilovers on a bunch of other cars and trucks, so I figured this would be a really straightforward process. Now, this was a pretty easy project, but at the same time it wasn't. Again, the purpose of this video is to show you some places where you might run into trouble and also show you how I got myself out of that trouble. First tip, read the instructions. My shocks didn't come with instructions, but after filming the video and started editing everything, I wanted to look and see what the instructions actually said, and it took me maybe 3 seconds to find using a Google search. So do that first. If you read the instructions, there's a couple things that you're going to note that are very important. Number one, the instructions say to not use impact tools when working on shocks because they might damage the shocks. Well, I use impact tools, so we'll see what happens. The second thing it says not to do is to not tighten down the bolts and the nuts until the truck is sitting on the ground. And I think this has something to do with the bushings twisting and stuff. So you want the truck to be on the ground where the bushings are supposed to be at ride height before you tighten down the bolts. That's another thing that I didn't do, even though I have worked on shocks before and every single time that was something I did do. I'm not really sure why I didn't do it this time. Anyway, we'll talk about that more a little bit later. For this upgrade, I chose Bilstein 4600s, and yes, it is pronounced Bilstein. I know in the US we say Bilstein because #America, but this is a German company, it's actually pronounced Bilstein. And if you don't believe me, let's ask Google Translate.
Bilstein. Bilstein.
Bilstein. Tip number 2 is to get the right length shock. Now, people always wonder whether they should get 4600 series or 5100 series, and the basic rule of thumb is that if you have a factory height truck or something shorter than 4 inches of suspension lift, then you get the 4600 series shock. If you have 4 inches of lift or more, it's a 5100 series shock. My truck has a leveling coil, which is good for about 1.5 inches to 2 inches of lift, so that's why I went with the 4600 series shock. Because the 5100 series shock is longer, in theory, those would give you a little bit more down travel on the suspension because it'll allow the suspension to droop a little bit more. But I'm not sure if that's a good thing. While doing this install, I realized that on these Rangers, if you don't have a sway bar, your shock is actually acting like a limit strap. Without a sway bar or a shock attached, if the suspension droops out too much, the coil will pop out of the coil bucket. I have not tested this, but it seems reasonable that if your shock is too long for your spring, when you're off-roading and your tires droop out all the way, there is a possibility that you might lose the spring, and that sounds really sketchy, doesn't it? On the compression side of things, if your shock is too long, that means that could limit the up travel. Or worse yet, if you bottom out really hard, you could have the pistons shoot through the body and you'll have a really bad day. So make sure you get a shock that fits your truck. If you have 4 inches of lift or more, get the 5100 series shock. If you have a truck that's factory height or less than 4 inches of lift, make sure to get the 4600 series. Now, keep in mind, this is for suspension lift only. Body lifts don't count. In fact, body lifts, let's just be nice, they're not my favorite. I don't really like them. So, anywho. Tip number 3, give yourself some room. Don't be lazy. If you've been watching my channel long enough, you might have noticed that I like to disassemble as little as possible. For this particular project, I wanted to see if I could swap the shocks without lifting the truck off the ground or removing the wheels. I also really wanted to avoid removing the fender liners because when I trimmed my fenders, I had to customize these fender liners and now they're held on there with like a million zip ties. And I didn't want to have to redo all that. By the way, if you're curious to see how I trimmed my fenders, I'm going to put a link to that video up here in the corner and also down in the description. I also did a video on how to customize those fender liners, which I know eventually I'm just going to pull out anyway because I don't like having them. I just did them because a viewer requested them. So links will be here and in the description. For the top nut on the shock, I daisy chained a bunch of wobble extensions so I could reach the nut through the engine bay. But to get the top nut off, you're also going to need either an adjustable wrench or a 19mm open end wrench. Otherwise, this will happen. Once you get the top nut loose, be careful not to drop it. These magnetic retrieval tools are really handy. Now the bottom bolt is super easy. I've seen videos where people were able to simply slide the shock off, but I've unbolted these shocks a couple times now, and I've always needed a crowbar to remove the bottom part. So with the tire in the way, I had a hard time getting a good angle on the shock. So I ended up jacking up the truck and pulling off the wheel. With the wheel out of the way, I was able to droop out the suspension a little bit more to take off tension off the shock. But I still needed the crowbar. After pulling the old shock off, I noticed the rubber bushing for the top mount wouldn't come out, so I tried prying it out. I then tried grabbing it with some locking pliers, but I ended up just cutting it out with some aviation snips. I'm pretty sure these shocks are the ones that came off the truck from the factory. They're 27 years old and they were toast. Look how easy it is to just compress it, and then it's got no rebound. Now compared to the new shock, I actually had to put some weight into it. The new shocks come with new hardware. I installed the bottom washer and the bottom bushing before sliding the shock up into the upper mount. I then tried to install the bottom mount, but the new bushing was really tight. So I went back up to the top mount, installed the new top bushing, the top washer, and hand tightened the new nut. I then jacked up the beam a little bit to see if I can get the eyelet and the shock to line up a little better. Like I mentioned, the bottom bushing was really tight, and I think this is because you want some room for it to compress and to move, and so it's a little bit tighter right from the factory. Tip number 4 is to use some lube. You know, lube's good because it helps you put things on, take things off, slide things in a little bit more easily and smoothly. Is that a little too suggestive? Anyway, so if you want to save yourself some trouble, use some lube. I didn't have any lube on hand and I was really adamant about getting this project done that same day, so I went without and it made the project way harder. I'm quite positive that if I did have lube, this whole thing would have been a lot simpler. So I'm gonna put links in the description for some lube that you can try. It's like $6, so spend the $6 and make your life a lot simpler. Using a rubber mallet, I was able to persuade the shock a little bit further onto the mount. I got the shock on far enough to thread the bottom nut a few turns and thought I could get it the rest of the way with my impact. But that caused the bushing to mushroom too much on one side, so I backed off the nut and tried again. Still wasn't happy with it. So I thought maybe if I can get the bushing where I want it, I can then slide the shock back over the bushing. After some more massaging, I was able to get to the bottom of the shock installed with the bushing sandwiched evenly on both sides. I then tightened down the top nut until the bushing squished down. I wasn't sure how much to squish the bushing, I just went by feel. But in hindsight, I think I might have squished it a little bit too much. The bushing is meant to give a little bit, but if it's too tight, it could wear out faster than it should. We'll see how it goes. So referring back to tip number 2, read the instructions. Okay, so I read that when you're compressing the bushing, you want to compress it so that it matches up with the metal ring thing, and then you lower the truck down to the ground and then you tighten it from there. After reading the instructions and after filming this entire video, I actually did end up jacking up the truck, loosen all the bolts, let the bushings breathe a little bit, maybe untwist from where they were, and then I lowered down the truck and I tightened down the nuts while the truck was on the ground. I'm not sure if that's gonna make any sort of difference, but hey, at least I tried. I'll let you know if the bushings fail prematurely. On the driver's side, there's a lot more room to work. The top nut is much easier to get to, and tear down on this side went much faster. But getting the bottom bushing on the shock mount was tougher on this side. I decided to try tightening down the top nut first to see if I could avoid having to compress the shock too much. But that didn't help. I couldn't get the angle right to mount the shock. I then figured that drooping out the suspension would be easier than having to compress the shock. This was when I learned that if you droop out the suspension too far without a sway bar or a shock installed, the top of the spring will pop out of the coil bucket. Thankfully, I was able to push it back and compress the spring back into place. After avoiding certain death, I struggled some more with the bottom bushing. At one point, I couldn't get the bottom bushing back on the shock, so I wet it down with some soapy water, and that helped the bushing slide more easily onto the shock. Should have got some lube. Eventually, I got everything lined up and was able to snug up the upper and lower nuts on the shock. Again, should have waited till the truck was on the ground to tighten these. Anyway, these shocks were a huge improvement over the old shocks that I'm pretty sure were on the truck for a whole 27 years. As an example, sometimes here in Spokane it gets snowy and icy, and I'll run around town in four-wheel drive high. And I noticed that when I'm making slow turns and stuff, the truck would kind of bog down, it would sink down and get stuck, and the four-wheel drive would do weird things. I know now, after playing around with the shocks and compressing them with my hands with zero effort, that when the front diff put down torque onto the ground, what ended up happening was the shock would compress and it didn't have any ability to rebound. So the truck would bog and get kind of stuck, and that's why the four-wheel drive will get stuck in small, slow turns. With the new shocks, four-wheel drive works great, I have great traction, and overall the truck just rides a whole lot better. It's got a whole lot less body roll, even without a sway bar, and it's just a lot nicer here in Spokane because our roads are crap, they're bumpy, and now with the new shocks it feels a whole lot better. I hope you guys found this video helpful, or at the very least entertaining. I'll keep you posted on how well the shocks go over time. I don't know if I damaged the bushings or if I messed up the shock by using impact, but we'll see. If the shocks fail early, I guess that'll just give me another reason to throw some long travel on this truck, because that's really where I want to go. But I was kind of tired of the old shocks, so I figured I'd make you this video and maybe show you what not to do when installing your shocks. So you're welcome. Final things, I'll post links to the shocks and the lube that I should have ordered and the tools that I use in the description, so if you're looking for that stuff, you can find it there. If you click those links and buy from Amazon, it doesn't cost any extra to you, but Amazon gives me a small kickback to help support the channel, and it helps me out a lot so I can keep making videos like this. If you have questions or kind suggestions, post them in the comments below. Again, if you're gonna be condescending, I'm just gonna delete your comment anyway, so just don't bother. Alright? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.